Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
They say family is everything, but sometimes that everything feels like a tight rope around your neck, tied by people who think they know you because they share your blood. That Sunday, the sun was high, the grill was hissing, and the smell of overcooked hot dogs danced in the air like a lie you tell yourself every Thanksgiving. That this time, it'll be different. I stood on the edge of the backyard, clutching a sweating glass of lemonade like it was armor, watching my older brother Zach hold court at the head of the picnic table. His voice had that cocky confidence, the kind only a man who's never been told no too hard, too often, can carry. Zach had always been the success story. Financial advisor, 2 kids, a granite kitchen, and a wife with Instagram perfect hair. Meanwhile, I was figuring it out. That's how my mom described me to neighbors. Grace is just figuring things out right now, with her painting and all. I once overheard her tell someone I had sensitive hands, whatever the hell that means. So when I showed up to the BBQ in cutoffs, paint still under my nails, and a bottle of decent Pinot in my hand, I already knew I was stepping into a minefield. I just didn't know Zach would go nuclear. We were halfway through paper plates of potato salad and soggy coleslaw when it happened. Zach, with barbecue sauce on the corner of his smug mouth, raised his beer bottle like he was giving a toast. To Grace, he said, our resident freeloading artist. Living the dream, right? The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like the snap of a rubber band against skin. My cousin Mike chuckled into his baked beans. Aunt Jo made that tight-lipped smile people do when they're trying not to pick sides. Even Dad smirked, eyes on his corn. And Mima? She didn't even look up. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just set my plastic fork down, reached into my bag for my car keys and said, I'll be back in 20. I've got a Zoom with Netflix. The silence was sudden, like the moment after a balloon pops. Then came the scoffing. Netflix? Someone repeated, like I just said I was dating Ryan Gosling. Maybe she's doing their logo redesign, Zach quipped. In finger paints. More laughter. Louder this time. Meaner. It filled the space between us like smoke from a grease fire. Ugly, sticky, choking. I didn't bother responding. I turned on my heel and walked straight to my car. Not running, not rushing, just walking like a woman who knew where she was going. The second I closed the door and rolled up the window, I allowed myself a tiny, bitter smile because they had no idea. Not yet. In the driver's seat, I connected to my hotspot, opened my laptop, and clicked into the Zoom link I'd saved to my desktop. It wasn't Netflix technically, but close enough. Amazon Studios. The exec I was meeting with, Lisa Granger, was running 5 minutes late, as usual. I leaned back in my seat, glanced at the string lights hanging across the backyard like fairy tales strung on a wire, and tried not to think about the humiliation burning in my gut. I wasn't lying. I was just being selective with the truth. When Lisa finally joined, she looked tired, but excited. She had that West Coast energy, blazers over yoga pants, optimism with a business plan. Grace, we're good to go on our end, she said. I've got legal drawing up the paperwork. 5-episode order, animated short form. You'll retain full creative direction, and we'll bring on a co-producer for logistics. My throat tightened. I swallowed. And the budget? I asked, because I needed to hear it again. 500,000, Lisa replied, almost casually, like we were discussing lunch plans. I nodded slowly, like this was normal. Like I'd been here before, even though my heart was beating like a damn bass drum. We'll announce in 2 weeks, she continued. And yes, you can tease it vaguely to people you trust, but nothing official yet. Trust. Now there was a word that didn't belong anywhere near my family BBQ. We wrapped the call, exchanged a few congratulations, and I closed the laptop. I sat in silence for a moment, hands gripping the wheel, breathing through what felt like a pressure cooker of validation, rage, and something else I didn't want to name. Not yet. When I stepped back out of the car, I didn't head straight for the table. I walked to the fence line, where the sound of laughter had returned to its easy, mindless rhythm. I watched Zach toss a frisbee to his oldest boy, his posture cocky, like a man who always wins, who always owns the room. I could have walked back and said nothing. I could have let the deal simmer in silence until the press release dropped and just let them eat their words quietly. But where's the fun in that? So I stood there, watching my brother try to play Dad of the Year for an audience, and I thought, maybe it's time they see what happens when the family joke stops being the punchline. And then the idea hit me, like lightning through my spine. Oh yeah, this was going to be fun. I walked slowly back toward the backyard, my laptop bag hanging off one shoulder like a weight I'd carried for years, though today it didn't feel so heavy. The sky was beginning to shift into that soft golden glow that makes even the ugliest places look like they belong on a postcard. And for a moment I wondered if maybe, just maybe, this day could turn into something different than every other time I'd been forced to eat my pride off a paper plate. The thing is, when people think you're a loser, it doesn't matter how much work you're doing in the dark. They already wrote your ending, so they don't bother flipping the page. But the truth was humming inside my chest now, pulsing like electricity under my skin. And it took everything in me not to grin like an idiot just from the satisfaction of knowing something they didn't. I didn't go back to the table right away. Instead, I ducked around the side of the house, leaning against the faded brick wall near the hose, where I could hear them talking, but they couldn't see me. It's a habit I've picked up, listening from shadows. There's a brutal kind of honesty in the things people say when they think you're not around. She's always been dramatic, my mom was saying, in that half whisper she probably thought sounded caring, but always came off condescending. Remember the time she cried because we threw out that pile of newspapers she called a project? She made us hang one of those creepy paintings in the foyer, Zach chimed in, his voice full of that performative disgust he loved using to make everyone laugh. Every time I walked by it, I thought it was a portal to hell. More laughter. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and exhaled slowly. If they only knew. If they had the smallest clue what had just happened in the front seat of my beat-up car, while they were over here passing judgment between gulps of light beer and stale coleslaw. I had just signed a 5-episode deal. 5 episodes. That's $50,000 per... Wait, no. $100,000 per episode. Jesus. I'd already made my first public mistake, and no one had even heard me say it yet. Still, it made me laugh a little, the idea that I could butcher the math on my own dream come true. That felt about right for me. I pulled out my phone and stared at the message Lisa had sent right after the call ended. Paperwork incoming, get ready, you're about to be known. Those words sat on my screen like a secret carved in gold. And for a second, I thought about showing it to someone, Morgan maybe. She was the only one at that table who didn't look like she was performing a role. But I stopped myself. Not yet. Instead, I turned and walked slowly back to the table, adjusting my face into something neutral. My dad was telling some long-winded story about his old office job, the one he quit before I was even born, and the kids were off in the corner screaming over a sprinkler. The world looked normal, but everything had changed. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat down at the far end of the table. My cousin Mike raised an eyebrow at me like he was waiting for me to say something dramatic or weird or both, but I just smiled. So, did Netflix cast you in a cooking show? He asked, nudging my elbow. Nope, I replied, taking a sip. They're the ones eating what I'm cooking. He blinked, confused, then shrugged and turned away. I didn't blame him. Most people don't know what to do when the girl they thought was invisible suddenly grows claws. It was Morgan who finally slid into the seat next to me, her phone out, her expression soft. She leaned in like she didn't want to be heard, and that, ironically, made me listen harder. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? She didn't look at me when she asked. She just stared at her hands, one finger idly tracing the rim of her wine glass. I didn't answer right away because I'd spent most of my adult life asking myself the exact same question. I was supposed to be the successful daughter. I'd been smart in school, got the degree, landed the corporate job in my 20s. but somewhere between the fluorescent lights and the fake smiles, I felt like I was choking on a life I didn't want. And the only thing that saved me was walking away, straight into obscurity, judgment, and broke-ass months where ramen was a luxury. And still, it felt more honest than anything that came before. All the time, I finally said. But lately, I feel like I'm writing a new one. Morgan gave a tiny nod. She looked like someone who was trying to remember the sound of her own voice after years of whispering. That's what your art feels like. I looked at your website, your stuff. It says something. I almost dropped my wine. You did? I asked, stunned. Of course, I follow your art page. I didn't know you knew. I didn't. And somehow that single comment, tossed out so gently it nearly disappeared, felt more real than every fake-ass congratulations I'd ever gotten from my own blood. We talked for a while, nothing deep, just soft things. Morgan told me she'd started painting again, that she used to sketch in college but gave it up when the kids came, that sometimes, at night, she watched YouTube tutorials just to feel like her hands could still make something. I listened, genuinely, and then I told her something I hadn't said out loud to anyone yet. I just signed a deal. It's for an animated series, based on my work. Her eyes widened like I'd handed her a lit match. Grace, she whispered. That's holy hell, that's amazing. I nodded, and it was. But it wasn't about the money, it wasn't even about the show. It was about being taken seriously, for once, not in spite of who I was, but because of it. Before she left, Morgan asked if she could post one of my prints to her Instagram. Just a little photo of a piece I'd given her months ago, something I thought she'd probably thrown in a drawer. I told her yes, and then I watched as she typed out the caption, slow and careful. So proud of @GraceTaylorStudio. Can't believe I know the artist behind my new favorite show. She hit post. And just like that, the fuse was lit. I didn't look at my brother the rest of the night. I didn't need to. The fire was already spreading, and he didn't even smell the smoke yet. There is a unique pleasure in silence when you know something no one else in the room does, especially when the people around you are the ones who've spent years slicing you open with backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive jokes dressed up as concern. That kind of silence doesn't sit still. It simmers. It curls up inside your ribcage like a cat settling in for a long nap. And as I stood in my parents' cluttered kitchen, refilling my wine glass with something dry and expensive my mother only brought out for guests, I let that silence wrap around me like a scarf. I wasn't in a hurry. That was part of the power shift. When you know your moment is coming, you don't need to announce it. You let the room breathe. Let them think everything's normal. Then you start pulling the threads. By the time I made my way back outside, the mood had shifted slightly, as if the air itself sensed the change, but didn't quite understand what it was. The kids were now inside, glued to a tablet playing some obnoxious animated show at full volume. The grown-ups, or what passed for them in my family, were parked around the fire pit, nursing their third or fourth drinks, the kind of buzz that makes people nostalgic for things that never happened. Zach was telling some story about a client who lost half his portfolio gambling on crypto. And of course, he told it with that smug grin that made you want to slap it off his face with a folding chair. I didn't interrupt. I just eased into the circle like I belonged there, like I wasn't the black sheep or the punchline, and I took my time sipping my drink. Watching him talk, watching his hands gesture like he was sculpting the air into proof of his own importance. Eventually, the conversation drifted. People started talking over one another, someone put on music that didn't quite fit the vibe, and for a while, it felt like the usual. Just another family gathering where nothing meaningful is said, and no one really listens. But then Morgan came outside holding her phone, her face lit by the soft blue glow of the screen, and I knew something had changed. She sat beside me without saying a word at first, just leaned in slightly and nudged me with her shoulder. I tilted my head toward her, a silent question, and she whispered, "You might want to check your notifications." I pulled my phone from my pocket, and there it was. A slow, steady drip of likes, comments, reposts. Her Instagram post was taking off, Not viral, not yet, but definitely catching attention. People were tagging others. Some were already asking about the series. Someone even commented, "I've seen this artist on Pinterest. So cool to know her work is getting animated." I didn't reply to anyone. I didn't need to. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that Zach saw it. And of course, he did. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at his phone, then looked at me, then looked at his phone again. His jaw twitched slightly, a little tick he gets when he's trying not to lose control. I took another sip of wine and pretended not to notice. The longer he stewed in it, the better. Let it marinate. Let him try to fit the puzzle pieces together while still clinging to the idea that I was just some flaky, broke painter he had to carry through life like a charity case. But he couldn't let it go. "So what's this post about?" he finally asked. Loud enough to draw attention but trying to sound casual. "Morgan said something about a show." His voice was light, but his eyes weren't smiling. I met his gaze and shrugged like it was no big deal. "Oh, yeah, I've been working on something for a while. Got picked up by a studio. Just a small animation project." "Which studio?" he pressed, leaning forward now. I could feel the others turning toward us. Their interest peaked. This was new. Grace had something real to say. That was unusual enough to warrant a pause in their collective self-absorption. "Amazon," I replied, dropping the word like a coin in a jukebox. Silence followed, thick and sudden. Even the music seemed to fade. Wow," Morgan said quietly, eyes wide. Zach chuckled, but it was forced. "Amazon, huh? What, like some indie side project?" "It's animated," I said calmly, "based on my art. Limited series. 5 episodes to start." He laughed again, but there was a crack in it now, the sound not quite landing the way he intended. "Good for you," he said, nodding like a robot trying to mimic human approval. "I guess all that freeloading paid off." And there it was, the slip, the thing he couldn't help but say, because it had become part of how he viewed me. But this time, no one laughed. Not even my mom, who usually smoothed over moments like these with a tight smile and an offer of more potato salad. Morgan looked down at her hands. My cousin Mike cleared his throat and took a long drink. Even Dad shifted in his seat, suddenly interested in the wood grain of the picnic table. I didn't flinch. I just smiled and said, "Turns out, freeloading looks a lot like working when no one's paying attention." That hit something. I saw it in his eyes, the flash of confusion, then embarrassment, then something nastier. He didn't like being called out, especially not in front of the family, especially not by me. I'd spent so long playing the quiet one, the weird one, the artsy one who couldn't quite get her life together, but now I was the one with something real, something tangible, and worse, he didn't see it coming. That night, long after the fire had burned down to embers and the adults were either passed out or peeling kids off couches to go home, I got the alert. Morgan's post had been picked up by a small but influential art blog. Nothing massive, but enough to start a ripple, enough to catch the attention of people who'd ignored my emails just weeks earlier. And sure enough, one of those people reposted it with a comment that made me laugh out loud. "Grace Taylor, about time someone gave her a platform." I looked over at Zach, who was scrolling his phone under the porch light, his expression dark and unreadable. He didn't say a word as he passed me on his way to the car, not even a nod. But I knew he'd seen it, and I knew this was only the beginning. The first thing I noticed the next morning, before I even opened my eyes, was the distant buzz of my phone vibrating on the nightstand like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. It wasn't just a message or two, it was a steady stream, notification after notification lighting up the screen, pinging softly through the silence of my apartment like a secret trying to make itself heard. For a brief moment, still half asleep and tangled in my sheets, I felt the familiar anxiety that comes when your phone lights up before your brain does. But then I remembered. It wasn't dread anymore. It wasn't a bill collector or a passive-aggressive message from my mother about checking in. It was the beginning of everything I'd been working for. and it had finally found its voice. I rolled over and picked up the phone, blinking through the glow. Instagram, Twitter. A couple of emails from names I didn't recognize, but vaguely recalled from old networking events I used to attend in cheap heels and a knockoff handbag, hoping someone would take me seriously. Morgan's post had done more than just get a few likes from her Pilates group. It had somehow, through the chaotic algorithm gods of the internet, landed in the right hands. People were sharing my work, tagging me, asking where they could see the show. One particularly enthusiastic comment simply said, "This is gonna blow up, I can feel it." And strangely, I believed them. I didn't rush to respond. That was the old me, desperate to prove I was worthy of attention. The new me, the one who had quietly signed a 5-episode animation deal and didn't need anyone's permission to be proud of it, just watched it all unfold with a kind of quiet, detached curiosity. It wasn't the fame or the recognition that I wanted, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good, but rather the shift in the narrative. I was no longer the punchline. I was the story. Later that afternoon, the official press release dropped. Amazon Studios announced the upcoming slate of indie animation projects, and there it was, my name in the middle of a list of creators as I'd followed for years, nestled between people who had studios and teams and actual agents. I read the paragraph 3 times, not because I didn't believe it, but because I wanted to commit the feeling to memory. They used words like visionary and bold, and though I still had trouble applying those labels to myself, I didn't argue with them. For once, I let the compliments sit where they landed, instead of batting them away like flies. The reaction was swift. My DMs flooded with messages. Old classmates, ex-colleagues, former flings I hadn't heard from since they ghosted me post-coffee date. All suddenly interested. All so proud and knew you had it in you. It was both hilarious and pathetic. How quickly people reposition themselves once they thought you might be worth knowing again. I didn't reply to most of them. I didn't need to. Let them sit in the echo of their own performative praise. But what truly surprised me, what made me sit down and put the phone in my lap like it was too heavy to hold, was the text from my mother. Just 5 words. "Congrats, honey, I always believed." No punctuation, no emojis, just the barest form of acknowledgement. And somehow, that hurt more than if she'd said nothing at all. Because it wasn't true. She hadn't believed in me. Not really. She'd tolerated me. She'd smiled through gritted teeth every time I said I was pursuing my art full-time. She'd nodded politely at my exhibits, but never once invited her friends, not even the ones who hung ugly, overpriced prints in their hallways and pretended to know something about composition. And then, as if summoned by the universe to remind me that progress never comes without a backlash, Zach texted me, just 2 lines. "You planned this. You humiliated me in front of everyone." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I knew he was spiraling, not because I'd done anything directly to him, but because the image he'd built for himself, Mr. Successful, Mr. Provider, Mr. One Who Always Wins, had finally cracked. And the worst part? I hadn't even tried. I hadn't called him out or exposed him or dragged him publicly. All I'd done was stop shrinking. I typed my reply carefully. "No, Zach, you did that." I just turned on the light. He didn't respond. Over the next few days, things got strange. Not dramatic, not explosive, just subtly off, like a song played a half-step too high. A few of Zach's clients, the kind who followed everything with a carefully curated sense of cool, started posting about the show. They didn't name me directly, but they used hashtags like #ArtThatMatters and #FinallyRepresentation. One of them even shared a screen cap of the press release with a comment, "Crazy how small the world is." I later heard through Morgan, who had become something of an unintentional informant, that Zach had fielded multiple questions at work about whether I was really his sister. Apparently, one client had been genuinely shocked. "You never mentioned she was the artist behind that show," he'd said, confused. "That thing's everywhere right now." Zach, predictably, had tried to play it cool. "Oh yeah, she's always been into that stuff," he'd said, as if my years of struggling were just a quirky little phase, like a gluten-free diet or a brief interest in yoga. But his veneer was cracking. I could feel it. And that gave me an idea. That Friday, an email came in from a morning show producer. They were doing a segment on rising indie creators and wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining a panel next week. It would be live, national, a small slot, but real exposure. I said yes before they could finish the sentence. I didn't even ask who else was going to be there. And then, the twist. Later that day, while scrolling through the show's lineup, I saw a familiar name, guest number 3, Marcus Delaney, real estate developer, media personality, and one of Zach's biggest clients. I couldn't have scripted it better if I tried. The morning of the interview, I woke up with the same tight knot in my stomach that I used to get before school field trips or job interviews. Except this time, it wasn't about proving myself or hoping someone else would give me permission to exist. This time, I had nothing left to beg for. I had already signed the contract. I had already heard my name read aloud on an official broadcast. I had already watched the people who used to pat me on the head with that strained, polite smile scramble to rewrite the story they'd created about me. But still, that knot twisted itself inside me, not from fear, but from something closer to anticipation, like waiting for a long overdue punchline to finally land. When I arrived at the studio, the air inside the green room was too cold, the kind of aggressive air conditioning that makes you feel like your skin doesn't quite fit. A production assistant handed me a schedule and offered me water, which I took mostly out of habit. I barely looked at the pages. I already knew what was going to happen. Segment 2, Creative Spotlight. Grace Taylor, creator of the upcoming animated series Mirror Season. And then, in Segment 3, Marcus Delaney, Zach's golden goose, his million-dollar connection, the kind of client who doesn't just move real estate, but controls conversations at fundraisers and country clubs with a single offhanded comment. I almost laughed when I saw his name printed there in sleek black font. Of all the people they could have booked, it had to be him. I kept my expression neutral, even as my thoughts sprinted ahead of me, spinning the possibilities like threads on a loom. I didn't plan to expose anything. That wasn't my style. Revenge, when done right, didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to come with yelling or accusations. It only had to reveal the truth, and then let people draw their own conclusions. So I sat quietly in the makeup chair, letting the stylist smooth my hair into something camera-friendly, while my mind danced in silence, already 10 steps ahead of whatever game Zach thought he was still winning. The interview went exactly as it was supposed to. The host, a polished woman with the kind of smile that never moved her eyes, asked about the inspiration behind my show, about the themes of identity and memory and surrealism woven into the episodes, and I answered with practiced grace, every word deliberate, every anecdote honed through years of explaining my art to people who never really listened. I mentioned the visual motifs drawn from my childhood, the emotional tension between perception and reality, and yes, I even slipped in a small offhanded reference to a family BBQ that sparked the opening scene. The host chuckled, clearly unaware of the full weight behind that sentence, and nodded approvingly as if she'd just uncovered some charming origin story about summer nostalgia. But I knew exactly what I'd said, and I knew who would understand it. When Marcus joined for the third segment, we passed each other briefly in the hallway, just long enough for his eyes to land on me with the kind of fleeting recognition that meant he knew who I was, even if he couldn't immediately place why. He greeted me politely, but something about his tone suggested he was hedging his bets, that he had learned to treat every stranger like they might matter, just in case. During his segment, I sat just off stage, listening to him discuss housing developments and commercial strategies and the state of the real estate market, with a kind of casual arrogance that mirrored Zach's almost perfectly. It wasn't hard to see why they got along. But then, near the end of his interview, the host mentioned the lineup of guests and asked him if he had seen the segment just before his. He smiled politely and said he hadn't, but when she recapped it, Grace Taylor, an incredible artist with a new series coming soon to Amazon, His head tilted slightly. Something clicked in his brain, and then he said it. Grace Taylor, he repeated, as if tasting the name. You know, I think I know her brother. There it was, the slip. Oh? The host asked, curious. Small world. Marcus laughed, not meanly, but with that detached amusement of someone who finds coincidences entertaining. Yeah, I work with a guy named Zach Taylor. Talks about his family sometimes. Never mentioned this, though. Surprised he didn't. And that was all it took. I didn't need to say anything. The camera wasn't even on me. But in that moment, on live television, the narrative cracked. Zach's client, the one whose approval he valued more than probably anyone else's, had just admitted in front of thousands that my brother had never once brought up the fact that his sister was about to be a nationally recognized artist. That silence, that omission, said everything. After the taping, I took my time packing up, moving slowly through the motions as while the adrenaline still coursed quietly through me. Outside the studio, my phone was already lighting up. Text from Morgan, a message from my dad. Just a thumbs up, oddly enough. Several reposts of the interview segment already circulating on Twitter, but the one I waited for didn't come right away. When it did, it wasn't a call. It was a voicemail. Zach. His voice sounded tight, as if he had swallowed his pride and it was sitting like a rock in his throat. Hey, he said, and then paused for a long time. I saw the interview. I guess I didn't know it was that serious. I've been thinking about some things. Maybe we should talk. I'm reevaluating. That was it. No apology, no ownership. Just a hint, a vague signal that he felt the shift and was trying to salvage his place in the new arrangement of power. I listened to the voicemail twice, then sat there in the parking lot, the engine idling, the air conditioner humming, and stared at the screen. I didn't delete it, but I didn't reply either. Later that week, I hosted my own small gathering. Not a BBQ, nothing that traditional. It was more like an open house with wine and music and scattered canvases leaning against the walls. A few friends came, some colleagues from the animation project, a couple of old acquaintances who'd stuck around long enough to matter. My father came too, unexpectedly, holding a bottle of wine in both hands like a peace offering. He didn't say much, just wandered the space for a while, pausing in front of a painting of mine he hadn't seen before. I watched the show, he said eventually, his voice lower than usual. Didn't get all of it, but it felt real. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of resignation that had taken years to build. That's the point, I said, and we both let that sentence hang in the air for a long time. That night, I sat alone in the studio, long after everyone else had left. The voicemail from Zach still sat in my inbox, unopened since the first listen. I didn't know if I would ever respond. I didn't know if there was anything left to say. Maybe some wounds don't close. Maybe some stories don't need sequels. Maybe silence, when chosen and not forced, is its own kind of ending. I looked around at the scattered remnants of the evening, the empty glasses, the soft echoes of laughter still bouncing off the high ceilings. The painting my dad had stared at for almost 5 minutes without speaking. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not closure, just space. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't set out to destroy anyone. All I ever wanted was to stop shrinking myself to fit inside the narrow version of me they had created. And when I stopped apologizing for blooming in a garden they never watered, some of them withered, some tried to grow, and some, like Zach, just stood there stunned, watching the sun move without their permission. And that, more than anything, was enough.